Okay, welcome everybody to today's session here at the Kennan Institute. My name is Joe Dresden. I'm a Senior Program Associate here at Kennan. I want to thank you all for joining us today to hear our panelists, and I'm here to facilitate what is sure to be a productive roundtable on the developing status of Russia's maritime power. I would also like to remind our guests and panelists today that today's discussion will be recorded and on the record. Before we begin, I would encourage you to stay up to date on our latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, and our new Russian language blog, if you read Russian, called In Other Words. You can also subscribe to our podcast, Kennan X and the Russia File. And we always leave this out, but the Kennan Cable is another publication of the Institute, and our speakers today have, or two of our speakers today have a cable that's not 100% ready for prime time, so it may drop live next week, but everybody here in the room gets a preview. We have printouts in the back of the room. Please also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. I'm now pleased to introduce our four roundtable panelists. First, we have Dr. Andrew Monahan, who is Global Fellow here at the Kennan Institute and was a George F. Kennan Fellow last year. Dr. Monahan is the founder and director of the Russia Research Network. Additionally, he is a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, in London, and non-resident associate fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. He's written extensively on Russian grand strategy, UK-Russian relations, and the Euro-Atlantic community's relationship with Russia. He's the author of Power in Modern Russia, Strategy and Mobilization in 2017, Dealing with the Russians, 2019, and Russian Grand Strategy in the Era of Global Power Competition in 2022. All of these are seemingly evergreen titles, I would think. Dr. Monahan also has a new book coming out this month called, or today, well, it says this month, but it's today, which is co-edited by our next panelist, Dr. Richard Connolly. By the way, we should have flyers in the back of the room for the new book, so please, those of you here, do take one. Dr. Richard Connolly is the director of the Eastern Advisor Group and senior honorary fellow at the Center for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies series at the, or CREES, sorry, that's my Georgetown affiliation shining through, at the University of Birmingham. His research interests include economic policy, the development of the Georgetown, the defense and energy industries, the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian economy, and Russia's role in the global economy. His most recent books are Russia's Response to Sanctions and The Russian Economy, a very short introduction in 2020. Next, we have Dr. Michael Peterson. He's the founding director of the Russian Maritime Studies Institute and professor at the U.S. Naval War College. His work focuses on Russian naval operations and strategy, as well as net assessments of high-intensity maritime conflict. Prior to his appointment, he served at the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council. He's also the author of Missiles for the Fatherland. Oh, I could read this. Piminud, National Socialism, and the V-2 Missile, 2009 and 2011, as well as articles, essays, and book chapters on military intelligence and strategic weapons history. How close was I to pronouncing that?
Close enough.
Close enough.
I'll give you full marks.
Like nuclear weapons. Okay, close enough. Finally, online, we're going to be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan. She is the head of research for the Royal Australian Navy, co-director of the Modern War Institute's Project 6633. Her interests include Arctic and Antarctic geopolitics, energy security, Russian grand strategy, and strategic studies more broadly. She was formerly a lecturer of strategic studies at the Defense and Strategic Studies course at the Australian War College. Dr. Buchanan has written extensively on polar geopolitics and has published two books, Russian Energy Strategy Under Putin, Implications for Australia, and also Red Arctic, Russian Strategy Under Putin. I will now let Dr. Monahan, Dr. Connolly, take it away.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's really a pleasure to return to the Wilson Center and particularly to the Kennan Institute, where I've had a great time as a fellow first, and I'm delighted to be able to contribute to the Institute's work. Hello and welcome to you all. Very much looking forward to our discussion today from different angles. Obviously, Russia is in one way right in the headlines. But there are also other things that we want to think about with regards to Russia, longer-term trajectory, and some of that's what we want to get into today. As Joe said, we have a new book out this morning, in fact today, The Sea in Russian Strategy. So we wanted really to present some of the themes in that book. And my role today in these remarks is just to give you an idea of what the book is about, the thrust, the arguments of the book, before handing on to some of the content, and then with Liz as the discussant. So it is really an effort to try to think through some of the changing characteristics of Russian power. And in my mind, informally, it's effectively a third volume in terms of thinking about Russian grand strategy. The first being Power in Modern Russia, then we move towards grand strategy, and now this idea, for me, the important word in this title primarily is strategy. And what we're looking at, therefore, is Moscow's assumptions about the future, the plans on which those assumptions are built, and then the question of implementation. So strategy is an executive process. And uses an intellectual tool that does two sets of things for us. The first, it helps us to shape the Russian leadership's priorities and the problems that they face. The second, it enables us to think through a longer-term trajectory, so linking through the past, the present, and looking ahead into the future, because many of the things that we'll be talking about today are structural plans that take shape over a decade or even two. As you will know from some of the previous discussions we've had here, I make great focus on the Russian strategic forecast and the Russian leadership's horizon out first to 2020 when they first shaped it, then 2030 and then 2035. And really that's the kind of longer term trajectory that I would like us to be thinking about today. So the book is in many ways an attempt to try and mix both policy concerns and policy interest with research. And it's in many ways a reintroduction to some of the key themes of Russian sea power. Slightly strangely, in my view, and this is a subject that's not received much substantive attention since the Cold War. A full generation, in many ways, has happened before someone's paid this subject real attention. But we notice that there's a substantive problem here. In fact, there's actually a reversal of our thinking, an inversion of our thinking about Russian power here when we think about the tragedy of the Kursk sinking at the end of the 1990s and the great degeneration and deterioration of Russian sea power to the middle of the 2010s, where we're suddenly talking about a possible fourth battle of the Atlantic and Russian submarine activity being the highest level since the Cold War and so on. So there is a visible challenge here. And I'm very happy that we're able to present this to an audience that has both US state policy interests in mind, but also that the Royal Navy is sometimes thinks about this too. So what we're talking about are the principles in the book, principles of maritime and sea power, Russian naval and maritime thinking and doctrine also, but also questions of production, industrial capability, and economic aspects to this. To be sure, the balance lies with naval aspects in the book. We're probably looking at maybe 60% of the book is focused on the Navy, because that's where most attention has been. But in some senses, I would like to emphasize also the 40% of civilian maritime and economic aspects to this. So, the changing characteristics of Russian power, I'd say three things that I would like us to really pursue in the discussion. We tend to think of Russia as a continental power, as a land power. And there's good reason for that in many ways. The Russian state itself often has thought of itself as a land power. But for much of the 2010s, you see an explicit effort by the Russian leadership to turn Russia into a leading maritime power, a seafaring power. And it's important to note this is not just Russian leadership activity. This is part of a wider trend of greater spending on maritime capabilities, on naval capabilities. And some of the questions that the Russian military leadership also look at now are really about understanding of maritime choke points, about sea transit, sea lanes of communication for the Russian economy, and so on. So even the Russian military also more broadly is thinking about this, as well as the wider political strategy. Second, we're talking about really a Russia that does not have a regional focus or is merely a regional question, but a Russia that has a Russian leadership that has a global horizon. So if on the one hand we talk about Russia not only as a continental power but as a maritime or seafaring power, we ought also to be thinking through our vocabulary for this question. The Russian leadership, I think, has a global horizon reflected in its maritime agenda. And the words I've tended to use in the past are Russia as a ubiquitous power on the one hand, but also as a polar power. That's not just Russia in the Arctic, that's Russia in Arctic and Antarctica. So Russia is a north-south, east-west global question here. And that, I think, is one of the questions that we'd want to look at more substantively. And the third changing characteristic here is that longer-term structural question of how Russian economic situation looks, and some of the things we'll possibly get into in the discussion about how the Russian economic how the Russian economy is now much more focused on building relations with states which depend, therefore, on sea and sea lanes and transit lanes. So those are the three aspects that we would think of as changing characteristics of Russian power. One might say, if there's been a complete reversal in our understanding over a decade about Russian naval and maritime problems, there are, of course, first ongoing problems within the Russian maritime domain, ongoing problems of debates, let's call it, about priorities, whether it's submarines or surface vessels, large vessels or small, and so on. We'll get into that. But also problems with implementation, as always. The Russian chain of command, including in the maritime domain, does not necessarily function as smoothly as it might. We might also say that what about the war in Ukraine? What about Moscow's war in and against Ukraine with regards to this? What does this do to a project that looks in the longer term? And actually, although the war is being fought most obviously on the ground, actually there's a pronounced maritime aspect to this. Not only because of the role of the Russian Navy, but because of the questions of the Sea of Azov, of the Black Sea and access to maritime trade routes. And in many ways, in my view, therefore, there are two things before I hand over to Richard. The first is that the war accelerates rather than reverses or changes this strategy. The war accelerates it rather than breaks it or reverses it. And second, almost whatever happens in the war, you will see a continued major focus on the sea in Russian strategy for the rest of the decade. When we see the development plans for the Northern Sea route, for instance, when we see some of the other economic plans and diplomatic relations being built with states in the Gulf and in the Indian Ocean, this is almost the case that regardless of whoever is president or leader of Russia and the Russian leadership team, you find that there will be a pronounced priority for maintaining this emphasis. So again, longer-term aspects to this. We can go back into the history, should you wish, with pleasure. But really, we've got that horizon out to 2030 and the changing world and Russia's role within it. So hopefully I've been able to structure this. There are various things, of course, with the book that you would like, and we would have loved to have included a couple of chapters on the individuals in the Russian Navy, the promotion aspects, the role of the Russian Navy within particular regions, perhaps. But this is the point of the book, to reintroduce the sea and strategy as far as Russian leadership is concerned. And with that, once again, Joe, thank you for having us and hosting us. Very much looking forward to our discussion. Richard.
Thanks, Andrew. And hello, everybody. Thanks to you, Joe, and to the Institute for inviting us to talk today. I'm going to make a few points about the economic dimension of Russia as a sea power. So I'm going to not address military or political aspects, but just instead focus on the economic side. And I'll make three relatively simple points. One relating to the changing nature of Russia's economic interests and the role that the sea plays in Russia's economic interests. And second, I'll look at how, as a result of those interests growing, the Russian government has for some time now, going back really the best part of 2 decades, allocated significant funds towards building the infrastructure to become the source of sea power that it envisages itself as being in the future. And then my third point will relate to the industrial capabilities, and this is the sort of weaker, more deficient part of Russia's capabilities, and that's not hampering, but it's somewhat slowing this turn that nevertheless is taking place. So first point is about Russia's economic interests. If we think about the traditional conception of Russia as a large continental land power in which sea plays a relatively secondary role, we can see how this was an oversimplification anyway, but in particular how it is and has changed quite drastically over the course of the last few decades. And if we think before 2022, what we'd seen, if we just take some very high-level economic broad brush observations, we can see that Russia's traditional economic relationships, which were focused firstly on the former Russian Empire, Soviet Union states, and then more than that, Western Europe or Eastern Europe for the most part. Economic relations with Asia, economic relations with the Asia-Pacific region, with Africa were much smaller as a proportion of Russian trade, investment flows, etc. Although we'll all be familiar with the role that Russia has played in different parts of the world, the economic weight behind its footprint was much, much smaller until relatively recently. And what we saw before 2022, certainly really going back to this century, has been a gradual shift east and south from the west. Now, Europe still remained Russia's principal trading partner, but its relative role was already diminishing before last year. As I say, Europe was still still occupied collectively the number one role, but it was beginning to be, if not replaced, then at least supplanted by China. The rise of China, of course, was something that affected Russia, and China had already before last year emerged as Russia's single most important trade partner. But Russia had also started to trade more with Turkey, more with India, more with Vietnam, more with other states where it didn't have those direct land links. And the Russian government was aware of this and had formulated various different plans and strategies where they made it very explicit that they envisaged a future where Europe's role would diminish. They saw Europe as a place that was really sort of beyond its best days. It was growing very slowly, if at all, and Russia's future, therefore, should be tied to more dynamic poles of the global economy, in particular China. And we saw this taking place. We saw more oil being transported to China. We saw the construction of LNG, liquefied natural gas, in the Arctic and in the Far East, that was intended principally to be directed towards for seaborne trade elsewhere. We also see Russia emerge as the world's largest exporter of grain and other wheats. And again, this is principally sent via the sea. So if a decade ago, land trade accounted for maybe 60-65% of Russian trade, today that's been slowly and over the last year quite quickly reversed. And now we're seeing the sea as being the principal route through which Russia trades with the outside world. That wasn't the case a decade ago, and it is the case now. And in particular, that's been accelerated over the last year. If we take oil and gas as an example, most of Russia's energy is the most, and hydrocarbon sales are the sort of lifeblood of the Russian economy. Most of it, the overwhelming majority, went to Europe. Oil pipelines, gas pipelines, coal that would go by rail as well as by sea. In the last year, we've seen that decline dramatically. Europe now imports around about a third of the volume of gas that it did before the war, and it looks unlikely to return to pre-war levels anytime soon. Oil barely flows to Europe. There's still some oil sold, but much smaller volumes than before. And instead, it's being replaced by India, by Gulf states, by China. Much of this flowing through the sea. The construction at breakneck speed of this fleet of oil tankers was a very important development. It means that Russia is no longer dependent on European demand for oil. They've made a very quick transition. It'll be messy, it's expensive, but nevertheless, it's one that has taken place. And this is likely to continue into the future, especially if at the broad geopolitical level, Russia's relations with the West remain in their current state or something like it. We're unlikely to see a return to the pre-war status quo. So therefore, the sea will continue to be extremely important. The Black Sea for grain exports to the Middle East and North Africa, the Arctic for the Northern Sea route. We've got somebody very well qualified to speak about that later on. So this is really important, and it's going to grow in importance. Now, the Russian leadership had recognized this a long time ago, and therefore it allocated significant sums of money towards the construction of infrastructure and ships of various different types, naval and commercial and otherwise, to facilitate this, to reflect the growing Russian interest in the sea. We see, despite the fact that the Russian naval shipbuilding program has been slow and hasn't been executed at the pace that they would, by tonnage, it is nevertheless the third most ambitious in the world naval shipbuilding program, behind only the American and the Chinese. There's a lot of ships in naval shipyards at the moment being built. They're being built very slowly, which is my final point in a moment. But the scale of the ambition is significant. But we've also seen that buttressed by a lot of additional spending through commercial state-owned entities and elsewhere on the nuclear icebreaking fleet, for instance, on the acquisition last year of enormous oil tanker fleet, on building more ships domestically to be able to facilitate the extraction and transportation of energy resources in the Arctic. All of this has been in play for well over a decade now and is gathering pace. A lot of money was allocated towards that end. So reflecting the fact that it, I think, has been up there in the list of priorities of the Russian leadership. Which brings me to my third point, is that of industrial capability, and I go into more detail about this in the book. And this is where Russia has been slower. It has these growing interests. It has allocated a lot of money towards building the infrastructure and fleet to reflect this. However, because of rather sort of diminished shipbuilding capabilities after nearly 2 decades of barely building any ships of any nature, a lot of skills and know-how had obsolesced, and as a result, they've been very slow in building different types of ships. There are still some areas of competence, nuclear-powered submarines, for instance, Sevmash. Russia does a pretty damn good job compared to most countries there. But in surface vessels, for the Navy, not so good. For nuclear icebreakers, they've shown progress across different classes and different sizes of vessel. There's been some areas where they've not proceeded as quickly as they'd like to. They've reduced their order for the giant leader class icebreaker, but nevertheless played more orders for the slightly smaller Arctica. Slightly smaller being bigger than any other icebreakers that any other country has built. So it has some areas of competence. The notion that shipbuilding is, a big Achilles heel of Russian industry is true in some areas, but in others not so true. But I do think that the general picture is one that the continued investment is required there if they are to build the domestic shipbuilding capabilities to be able to support these growing sea ambitions in the future. And bringing it to the present day, the breakdown in relations with the West and the relatively slow and patchy integration with China means that Russia's relying on its own domestic capabilities. There's not much scope for transferring shipbuilding know-how from South Korea, from China, which had been the case in recent years, or from Norway, or from Finland, or from Germany. The scope for this is now much reduced. So the Russians are going to be forced, it would appear, to rely more on their own resources to remedy this deficient area of their sort of broader sea power. I think I've gone on a bit longer than I'd hoped to, so I'll leave it there and hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation. As someone who has spent most of his career behind the closed doors doing classified research, it's lovely to be back here for the third time in a year, particularly so because I'm doing it with 2 very good friends of mine and 2 very good friends and colleagues. So thank you for having me. The title of my chapter in this book is called toward an understanding of maritime conflict with Russia. It's fairly well laden with operational concepts and some doctrinal analysis. And I'll get into that a little bit here in my remarks. But what I'd like to do first is make a sort of broader statement about Russian military analysis and how we might think about Russian military analysis as a way to explain how I have been thinking about this when it comes to analyzing what the Russian Navy might be doing and how they might perform in a conflict. I think that there are some factors that the Russian military analytic community quite understandably may have missed, and I consider myself to be part of that community, and I accept that criticism for myself as well. But I think that there are some areas I think that we should maybe consider going forward, as I'm sure Russia embarks on its own bit of internal reorganization, reform effort in the wake of its disastrous performance in the Ukraine war. So I'd like to start just by saying here that I think Russian military power for quite a long time now has been evaluated on its own. That is, absent the international context in which it exists, not just versus NATO, not just versus the United States, but in the broader global context in which it actually resides. Russia, as Andrew has pointed out many, many times, seeks global power, and we should be evaluating the Russian military as a global power that also may feature in regional conflicts. What does that mean? I think in part what that means is that one of the many things that the Ukraine war teaches us as well is that we can't evaluate military power solely in terms of a single country's capability and capacity. Or a single country's strategy. I think all of that should be set into a broader context. Those factors matter. Those individual factors matter. How many ships does a nation have? How many jets can it fly out on a given day? All those sorts of things, as does military strategy. But how that compares to an adversary's attempts to defeat those capabilities is really also important here. It needs to be mixed into that analysis, I think, a little bit more going forward. As always, the question is compared to what? And I think that's a useful guide to think about Russian military power. I think another lesson that the Ukraine war teaches us is that the development of operational concepts matter. It matters equally as much as military strategy, and it matters equally as much as building out capability and capacity. As scholars, we sometimes find, I think, operations research and operational concepts at the operational level of war to be kind of mysterious or kind of boring or something that's not really all that matters all that much. We'll just leave that to the folks in the military to do. But I think what that does is it does not allow us to tie together economic investments in the military with tactical use on the battlefield. And I think we've seen that in Ukraine, that despite massive investments in the Russian military, the tactical result has not been as we might expect. That's obviously for lots of different reasons, but maybe we can talk about that more in the Q&A. So, for example, we know that before the war, Russia built out extremely sophisticated electronic attack capabilities, extremely sophisticated. But we know now during the war that the operational employment of those capabilities has led to a tremendous amount of electronic fratricide. So the point is that they know how to use these things tactically, they know how to use these things strategically, they have an idea of what they want to accomplish, but at the operational level of war, they have not developed concepts for the proper employment of these new tools. So I think that's another productive avenue of research for Russian military scholars. And finally, there's the impact of geography, I think, to consider. I think that matters quite a bit. And I was really gratified in 2022 to see just how many experts on mud there were on Twitter. But what I really mean by geography is the effect of time and space. Especially in the maritime domain. It's hard we can look at a map or look at a globe or look at Google Earth and understand that those distances are pretty vast, but it is really hard to grasp unless you're actually out there. I have spent time on an aircraft carrier crossing the Atlantic. It is massive. It is a massive space. And time is a factor. Geography matters. And I think we ought to be including that a little bit more in some of our research. So coming around to maritime operational forces, to the sort of content of this chapter a little bit more, I'll try to sort of use those remarks as a quick way to guide our discussion on the Russian Navy. So we know that the General Staff has outlined specific wartime tasks for the Russian Navy. You can actually pop onto the Ministry of Defense website right now and have a look at them. They include, in the threatening period, crisis deterrence missions, conflict isolation and limitation, defensive maritime economic activities, and so forth. And in the initial period of war, they include things like standoff land attack, to include conventional intercontinental attack, protection of the strategic nuclear deterrent, maintenance of a favorable operational environment, and many other tasks. There's actually a pretty extensive list on the website. And these are all our tasks that, based on the historical evidence, we know, I think that Russian naval forces, as currently constituted, are quite capable of executing on paper. But what happens when the real world of the operational environment, the geographic environment, adversary efforts to defeat Russia's naval efforts, and other factors, the absence of operational employment concepts or the presence of operational employment concepts interacts with all of those things, right? So it has a strategic mission, it has tactical capabilities, but what happens when you meet those things in the middle? So I just very quickly on geography. The North Atlantic is 6.4 million square miles, just using the Atlantic alone, just for a moment. It's 6.4 million square miles. I think it's worth keeping that in mind as we go forward in this discussion. It's a massive geographic space, as I mentioned, and Russia is deeply reliant on its fleet of ocean-going nuclear-powered submarines to cover that space. And achieve these tasks in what it calls the far seas and the world oceans. But it suffers from three major constraints. One is mission proliferation. If it is to protect the SSB in force, if it is to battle other NATO navies, if it is to conduct land attack and threaten conventional escalation, it has too few platforms to do this, to execute this over 6.4 million square miles. The second is lack of sufficient open ocean intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. There are too few intelligence collection satellites and aircraft in the Russian inventory to transmit targeting coordinates to ships or submarines that are ready and available to shoot. And on the third and related note here, even if it had sufficient ISR, I think the Russian Navy has no guarantee that there will be a vessel in the right position and able to shoot at a given time and place because of the massive space that it has to operate in. It's especially true if it's a submarine, given lots of tactical issues that maybe we can talk about later. So, and finally, without weighing the discussion down to too many details here, the U.S. Navy and NATO navies have been aggressively pursuing operational techniques and capabilities to reduce, to magnify Russian weaknesses and to reduce risk to its own force. Russia may have the world's most sophisticated inventory of anti-ship cruise missiles. But if U.S. ships are conducting effective counter-ISR, if they are conducting effective operational maneuver, then that missile is useless. Unless you have someone telling you where to shoot it, where to point that weapon, it's a useless piece of expensive hardware. So despite these limitations, and I'll try to wrap up quickly here, despite these limitations, we're still left with a Navy that has accepted a global role, a global warfighting role. And has accepted theater-level warfighting tasks. So what will it do in a conflict? How will it seek to minimize the weaknesses that I have described and maximize its strengths? Well, happily, we have an unclassified body of operations research published in Russian that helps us to understand what that looks like. So one of the things that the Russian naval thinkers have focused on for quite a long time, this will come as no surprise to anyone, is land attack, land attack against fixed targets on shore. The Russian Navy is quite good at this. They have succeeded to terrible effect in Ukraine with this, and they did so in Syria as well. They've got quite a good track record at this now. We have ample evidence that they can do this. It's not to say that they won't try to seek out NATO or U.S. ships, but that is to say that focus of those activities will be on land attack warfare, because it's just comparatively an easier task. It's easy to know where a fixed target is, and very easy to put a weapon on top of that target. Much more easy than it is to do so with a fleeting, ephemeral, moving target at sea. So they will focus these these strikes on fixed targets as a way to shape the operational environment and induce the adversary's naval forces, that is the U.S., NATO, whomever, to come forward, to shrink the geography so that they are moving into an area where Russians, it's called where the sort of geographic strength gradient shrinks, where this where the searchable volume of ocean is smaller, where the area in which it can impose greater cost against adversary navies is smaller, and they have a greater capability to do so. So. In the real world, what does that look like? I think this means local land strikes in the initial period of war that reduce enemy maritime domain awareness and limit the use of forward air bases. And then theater strikes into more strategic locations, such as Keflavik, or other primary air bases and naval bases that will be featured at the strategic level of conflict. So. That will open up an area for a sort of longer range campaign. And those strikes will compel forces to come forward, naval forces to come forward and deal with the Russian Navy, because they're essentially conducting those strikes. So that's all it's all pretty tactical. I think it's too tactical to be of interest to a lot of people. But that is to say, I think there's a clear conceptual vision for Russian thinkers here. So they have bridged that gap between technology and strategy and tactical use with conceptual employment now that will be that is available to them and bears the hallmarks of thorough thinking about this. This is likely to remain the shape of Russian naval operations to come for the next decade. The Navy has been, to my mind, actually fairly successful in Ukraine, has suffered relatively few losses, and has not borne the same costs the way the rest of the Russian military has in Ukraine. So I wonder, I think it remains to be seen the direction of the reform effort will go with regard to the Navy in the future. So I'll stop there. I apologize, Liz, for going on a bit long here, but over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. It's not quite fair to have me after Mike, so apologies. This is such a fascinating book. I've been flicking through it over the past week or so. And it is super critical to the debate today. As Richard just really briefly noted, Russia has moved to the sea, right, for its economic lifeblood. And this is super interesting because the framing continues to be this concept of the EU being able to, quote unquote, choke out Russia by switching off its lust for Russian energy reserves. Point is, Moscow has pivoted, and some time ago, to the next kind of future heart of the global economy, obviously in Asia. A quick other point I wanted to make before I spiel on for 10 minutes about the Indo-Pacific view of Russian maritime strategy is I am constantly concerned that Russian sea power, or the concept of Russian sea power, is approached as either having lofty ambitions that will never be realised, or being the tool of a looming conflict, again, a new Cold War, or conflict between Russia and the West. We completely miss nuance in this debate more broadly. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific theatre, what's fascinating, I think, to a lot of analysts down at our neck of the woods is that strategic competition in a naval sense, maritime naval sense, absolutely kicked off in the early 2000s when Russia really started cultivating its economic relationships in Asia. We've got 20 plus years of trust and dialogue versus the more recent Australia, US pivot to the Pacific or to sort of the ASEAN community. Culturally, we get it so wrong as the West, but that's probably another roundtable in itself. And the second point, and from Indo-Pacific point of view, I think, is the concept of how we think about looming conflict with Russia at sea and what that conflict or war might look like, in my opinion, will look quite different to the iterations of the past. I think principally geoeconomic warfare on steroids is going to be the name of the game in the Indo-Pacific community, but I think the West is extremely slow to grasp what's coming, and I urge you all to pick up the most recent Australian Defence Strategic Review to have a flick through how we have conceptualised our primary theatre of interest in the region. Cliff Notes is it's quite narrow and it's god-awful. So I'm going to speak for 7 minutes now. I will cut it short to the Indo-Pacific view of Russian maritime strategy. So I've picked 3 key areas that I think are touched on briefly in the book, but really worth looking to for the future. The first is the Pacific Fleet identity. Second is Southern Ocean and my Antarctic baby. And the third is the Indian Ocean region. And then I've got a few thoughts to kind of kick off discussion if Andrew will allow me to pontificate crazy Australian thoughts. So what follows from now are views from me only, and they're not those of the Australian government or the Royal Australian Navy. I wanted to kick off, first of all, with a really cool vignette to illustrate Australia's long-held concerns and kind of red peril with Russian maritime power. So quite literally, this country has been concerned with a looming Russian invasion since the 1800s. So the context of this is and sorry for the history buffs if I completely ruin this, the context is the 1878 Russian-Turk War, in which Britain was so concerned that Russia would expand her empire into India that it put all colonies globally on alert to arm up. Now, in 1882, public fear spread in Australia that there was a Russian invasion about to occur when 3 Russian naval ships, the Africa, the Vesnik and the Platon, were sighted at Port Phillip in Melbourne. And there's some really cool open source articles that are available through our archive, just if you know the news headlines there that were generated. So the sighting actually led to Australia in 1879 building her first ever warship. So we can surmise that we are well acquainted with Russia and the threat that comes from sea. But of interest, I think personally, as a government research scholar in Australia, is the lack of institutional knowledge of this history. And this is also an issue we have with understanding the kind of Soviet naval footprint in the Indian Ocean as well. It doesn't help that we've got this 24-hour news cycle and the death of area studies expertise, but it really has led to a fundamental shock when Russian ships pop up in the region. It shouldn't be much of a surprise, is my main point. So in terms of the key aspects of Russian maritime development in the Indo-Pacific, first point is around the Pacific Fleet identity. So obviously the book covers off the nuts and bolts of Russian sea power, but my sense is that we need to stop treating the Pacific Fleet as a doorway to Asia, in the sense that Russia is some sort of bridge between Europe and Asia. I think this identity, moniker, whatever you'll call it, has all but been abandoned by Putin, and we should start to be viewing Russian engagement with Asia in the manner of the Indo-Pacific community appears to do so. So very much this community sees Russian sea power and Moscow more broadly as an alternative pole. It's an option for diversifying power relations in an increasingly tense China-US paradigm. States in our region want options. So this isn't about ideology, and the Pacific Fleet is viewed by many Southeast Asian states to pose a potential balancing force for the region. So I think that's worth keeping in mind when we think of the Indo-Pacific and the role of the Pacific Fleet and how that's viewed. Optionality is central. Second, I've got a few points just around Russian sea power in the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. So I do think we all need a seminar completely on Russian Antarctic affairs alone, because that is just, it's critical to be across, but it is moving at a rapid pace. So I wanted to focus my remarks on the lockstep nature of Russia and China in terms of their maritime strategy to block the development of new maritime or marine protected areas, MPAs we call them, in the Southern Ocean. So just last week, we've had just shy of 6 years of negotiations. Both states blocked the establishment of 3 new areas, which totaled about 1.2 million square metres of ocean in the Southern Ocean at Kamla. Now, they use the same interesting excuse, which is, no, we need to conduct more research to understand what we are protecting, which is fascinating because such research, we know, is primarily around hydrographic mapping, which continues to be the aim and primary form of business when it comes to the Southern Ocean, for critical minerals and resource deposits for both states. I've got a few extra points there about China-Russia engagement in the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. I think people assume there's a bit of, I don't want to use the A word, alliance, but there's probably, we sort of overbake and over-egg the extent to which the two states really do work together in a strategic kind of long-term approach to the continent of Antarctica. But we can get into that if we have time, Andrew. And the third point sits around the Indian Ocean region. So this is just such a fascinating space, a subset, I guess, of the Indo-Pacific, particularly because a lot of the Allied plans for dealing with China potentially would be, to deliver on a blockade of Chinese oil imports from the Middle East. So we know the Indian Ocean is critical here. And then you've got, 80% of EU trade has an origin from the Indo-Pacific. So we would see a worldwide economic crisis if we, West, decided to clamp down on Chinese oil imports through the Indian Ocean. But I wanted to focus my remarks on the changes in Russian access to the region. We don't see as much engagement with China as I would have expected in the Indian Ocean. What we have absolutely is this emergence of an Indian-Russian north-south corridor, which ultimately plans, and I think it's making quite good progress, to link the Arctic Yamal Peninsula projects, oil and gas, to the Indian Ocean. So as much as we talk about sea power and the role of the Russian Navy, I think we also need to think about the way in which Russia utilizes the sea as a connectivity kind of point in its fabric for other lines of communication that do go on land. Like, I don't think we should separate them as much as we tend to. Russia obviously utilizes South Africa to resupply and to launch to Antarctica, that it is gateway city of choice. The Indian Antarctic program also conducts resupply and is aided from Moscow from this point, utilising the Indian Ocean, obviously down to the Southern Ocean. I think traditionally our focus on what Russia is up to in the Indian Ocean region tends to focus on arms exports. I think we're far beyond that. Again, area studies, we just absolutely need to invest in that. But today, again, this is about Russia offering an alternate geostrategic centre of gravity to the region. So we can unpack the Suez Industrial Park investments that are going gangbusters for Russia, Madagascar, obviously, the Sudanese replenishment naval port and the developments underway there to expand, but also we are slowly getting, I think, open source information as to the extent of Russia's telecom network financing, engagement control throughout the African continent. So to conclude, in terms of the outlook or things to watch from an Indo-Pacific centric point when it comes to Russia and its naval interests or its maritime strategy. First, Russian naval presence, and I think maritime strategy more broadly, is increasingly viewed by the region as a viable option for diverse geopolitical activity. So this is not about acting as a counterweight. I think we get that wrong. States in the region are quick to acknowledge their own commitment to the ASEAN principles, of non-interference and non-alignment. But in the West, we tend to make a power assessment very much on emotion and ideology and history. But in this region, the Indo-Pacific more broadly, it's immensely nuanced, and that's the reality. So I'm hesitant to agree that Russia will align with China in the region in a maritime sense when it has the opportunity to have many partners as opposed to friends. Second concluding point is I urge those interested to watch the development of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, so IORA. So this is the peak ministerial multilateral for the Indian Ocean region. It has 25 members, including Australia, 10 dialogue partners, including Russia, China, and the US. Now, 2 weeks ago, Russia launched its first ever dialogue partnership program within the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Now, this is called the Indian Ocean Rim Association Russian Blue Economy Initiative. Now, we've got quite sparse details, but there is a clear agenda here that is emerging, and I would, in terms of the open source capability, urge those interested to have a look at the similar approach used by Russia to how it has handled its 60 years of agenda shaping in the Antarctic Treaty System. So the way in which China and Russia, India, as I guess a new troika, has been navigating maritime centrality is certainly worth watching. Nonetheless, the US, the West more broadly, has this idea of when it comes to the sea, its strategy appears to be fixated around the idea of freedom of navigation, trade-centric, and they're the security priorities in our conception of how we use the sea and what the sea offers us in terms of security. But when it comes to Russia, I think that the difference is this is a state that looks to that, how it can utilize the sea, but also how it can utilize it in a way that is not the 3 to 10 year election cycles that we have, but this is 100 years. These are long-term projects. So I think, we've got to get in the game. Thank you. I'll hand over to the chair.
Well, thanks very much. We are not going to compress our question and answer series to 3 minutes. We're actually going to go another 15 minutes. I'm going to ask the audience here to raise your hand, which is great, so I can take track of who's asking questions. When you ask a question, please have it end in a question mark, and please, less than 5 sentences would be great. When you do also ask your question, reach for the nearest microphone, push the button so you see the green light at the base, and speak directly into the microphone as I'm doing now so that we can all hear you. And so we'll start over here.
Thank you so much and congratulations on this very interesting book. I look forward to reading it. I'm a fellow here. Before that, I was at the Pentagon at the time when Russia entered Syria and annexed Crimea. My question is, as we see one of the developments of the Russia's greater presence in the Navy is a greater risk-taking behavior, right? They're disrespecting national waters, as we saw recently, most recent, like yesterday, they crossed the Taiwan waters. Our concern was at that time is whether the risk management and escalation control architecture that was developed at the Soviet time is still sufficient, and do we see any progress in addressing that as the space becomes where they operate wider and the number of actors which are engaged is much more heterogeneous? That's kind of my question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yes, I'm familiar with those questions as well. I would say there is both a short-term and a long-term answer, and I'll be very brief. And forgive me if it's an insufficient answer. So for the audience, there are essentially two agreements. One is called INCSEA, the Encounters at Sea. Forgive me, I'm blanking exactly on what the acronym means right now, but it's a planned dialogue for managing how ships will behave, Russian and American ships will behave at sea. The other one is called CUES, the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea. That is also, so essentially what I think about this is that there is a structure in place, there is a sufficient structure in place, but the conditions under which we can, well, for lack of a better term, operationalize that structure right now don't exist. And that is a result of the Ukraine war. I am not about to make an argument for the reestablishing the INCSEA dialogues. It's a touchy diplomatic question, but I think structurally there is a sufficient mechanism to manage those encounters. It just depends on the political will to actually operationalize those things, and that, of course, is a far different question.
John, your question?
Yes, a quick question about the Siberia and the Russian Far East. How dependent is Russian military power in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific? How dependent will it be on greater success in developing the economic and industrial capacity of the Russian Far East, the Vladivostok region, and so on, or conversely, to what role can naval power, commercial naval power, also commercial power, and so on, play in helping to develop the Far East? Because I get the sense that really is going nowhere. I know we have an expert here on this, somebody who lived in Vlad, but.
I think the leadership envisaged that the Far East would play a more important role. So the idea was that they would revitalize older shipyards, and we've seen orders, as those who follow this, placed for the construction of certain vessels out in the Far East. The idea there was that they would reanimate these capabilities that had really degraded tremendously over the previous 25, 30 years. So we are seeing production of smaller warships out there at a smaller scale now. So that was one aspect. The other bigger scale is Zvezda, the civilian shipbuilding enterprise that has been led by the development of which has been led by Rosneft. And the idea behind that was that would serve as a source for cooperation with wider powers. So South Korea and Chinese involvement was present and still is, albeit to a diminished degree, in the construction of Zvezda, and that they would build their large ships that they were unable to build before and use those for the development of the Arctic and the Far East and for naval capabilities there. So the idea was that the Far East would play an important role, and that by doing so, that would help reinvigorate the Far East as well. So it's sort of a dual, mutually reinforcing process. As you've suggested, it's not necessarily gone firmly to plan. The shipbuilding in Far East has taken place at a slower rate. Having said that, they are producing ships now, which they hadn't done before. So as ever with Russia, they have grand ambitions. They don't necessarily matched by the execution, but if we're looking at trajectory, it's moving in the right direction. In addition to that, there will also be other sort of ancillary aspects to this. So one, for instance, would be, in particular now that more has been this accelerated shift towards the east, there will be an emphasis on building grain export terminals for heading east. There'll be an emphasis on, I would imagine, and there's certainly talk of this, but of building the rail infrastructure to take things to those Far Eastern ports. So there is joined up thinking going on. It's just that as ever, some parts aren't moving as quickly as they would like. But trajectory-wise, yes, they do see it as being important.
Michael.
Thanks. Michael Keyes, state detailee to the Kennan Institute and former CG in Vladivostok from 2016 to 2019. Two short questions. So first for Michael, how vital is the port in Syria and to Russia, and is Cuba again on the sort of the map or increasing in its role for Russia in terms of its projection of global naval power? And then for Andrew, I guess my question would be, is there an Admiral Sergei Gorshkov now, who's, a new sort of thinker? Over.
Thank you. What an interesting question. I'll be as brief as I can. I think that Tartus, the port in Syria, is extraordinarily valuable for Russians' global ambitions. And we've seen that in action, even setting aside global ambitions for a moment. We've seen that at the sort of operational level over the last year or so. Tartus has enabled a Russian fleet to converge in the Mediterranean and sustain itself.
I'm gonna interrupt for a second.
Oh,
I'm not
I'm
sure
sorry.
your microphone's on.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, sorry, Liz. I turned the microphone off, not on.
Let's leave them on.
The short version of the answer is that it's really important because Tartus has allowed a global navy to converge into the Mediterranean and sustain itself. One can ask oneself whether or not it's really pleasant shore leave to go to Syria, but that's another issue altogether. But it's interesting, right? To Andrew's point about a global navy, these are the sorts of things that allow that to happen. There was a Pacific Fleet contingent that came down into the Mediterranean, as we know. There's a Northern Fleet contingent that comes down into the Mediterranean, as we know. A Baltic Fleet, same thing. With regard to Cuba and with regard to of all other countries, Venezuela, I think those are also potentially vital outlets. It's been interesting, though, that the United States has been applying a lot of diplomatic pressure, I think, on those countries to not allow Russian naval port visits. We have seen the example of the circumnavigation of the Gorshkov frigate, which is not allowed to dock, and we have seen this latest example of the Gorshkov frigate traveling down to South Africa. Well, it's interesting that they didn't even bother trying to patrol somewhere into the Western Hemisphere and maybe make a port call into Venezuela or Havana. I would argue, though, that yes, those are very much on the menu at some point in the future.
I'll raise a question. Has there been a lot of needed rethinking or planning regarding the Taiwan Strait and the fact that the energy corridor is now a two-lane highway in effect, coming and going? What's been the policy response to that change with Russians' increased energy exports?
Liz?
You're off. Put it on.
I did put it on. Liz?
So after I tell you I cannot give an Australian government response, you throw in Taiwan. Interesting. So the question was, what is the implication of congestion for Russian exports, did you say?
Not just, congestion, I don't think there's a physical constraint, but I mean, it must change the calculus of various powers in the region and the United States and what have you, given that there's now energy moving, to the right and energy moving to the left. Russian energy going south and west, and Gulf energy going north and east.
Yeah, okay, got you. I think, obviously, any disruption of resource supply, trade through the straits would be disastrous, right, for the global economy. But there are so many states within Southeast Asia that I think would have enough of a diplomatic, I know this probably isn't the political way to say it, but would have much more of a diplomatic power than we realise to ask China or to kind of expect China to play nice in that region. But when it comes to the Taiwan Strait, we're looking much more at the potential for what India could do with the Andaman Straits, right? So I think sometimes we fixate on the hot topics that are the choke points in the Indo-Pacific, but there's so many other ones that I think are about to kick off or that have the potential to be much more disruptive.
Okay. Any remaining questions in the room?
There was one still over here to answer on the Gorshkov. In regards to the Gorshkov question, the simple answer is no. But I think it does deserve a fillet, because actually the Gorshkov role, oddly enough, is being played by Gerasimov, because he is the one who has overseen the shift in overall prioritization of the Navy. He is the one that has moved towards unified strategic commands first, and then overseen the establishment of the military district in the north as a naval point of focus. So he is the one who is overseeing. It's not the Yevmenov, the current com is the one doing this. It's Gerasimov's view changing the role of the Navy. If we think what Gorshkov talked about, without going into too much discussion of the Soviet strategy, it's about how the Navy plays a role on a global horizon. And that's Gerasimov's discussion. He is the one, in his speech to the defense attachés last December, which I really recommend you have a look at, he's the one that talks about the Northern Sea route, Taiwan, and the problem of AUKUS. So he is the one who's talking essentially the top three problems he talks about, apart from obviously what's going on in Ukraine. He's naming 3 maritime problems. This is a ground forces commander. This is a cavalry officer in proper Russian terminology. He's a tanker. So, but when it comes to the Navy itself, mostly I think what you have is a series of operational commanders. So Yevmenov and even the Northern Military District, the military district there's, and this is something of a reflection of the departure of lots of officers through the 1990s and into the 2000s, and a failure through the New Look reforms to train and develop new senior officers in this division. So lots of inheritance is reaping its rewards now, and it's ironic that the man who is overseeing this greater maritime role in the armed forces is actually an old-fashioned tanker.
Can I just add a quick two-finger to that? The one person you may be interested in reading is a former commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy, to Andrew's point, and that's Vladimir Kuroyedov. And he took his PhD back in 2001, I believe is when it was. And the person who attended his dissertation defense was none other than Vladimir Putin. The problem with Kuroyedov now is that he's been on the outs for 15 years, but in terms of carrying forward the intellectual legacy of Gorshkov, I think he is the most important person, because he's still an active publisher and he still fancies himself something of an academic, and he writes fairly extensively about the interrelationship of global economics and naval military power. Now, he was sacked because of a variety of internal challenges to the Russian Navy, including accidents and sailor training and all kinds of things. But from an intellectual perspective, he has been the person who carries forward that legacy. But he's been out since 2007.
Andrew, do you have any concluding remarks, thoughts?
Sure, thank you. The seeds of this, in many ways, came from, actually, since Liz is on the call, the seeds from this came from the moment that perhaps you remember in 2014 with the G20, when a Russian flotilla turned up off the north coast of Australia, and suddenly there was a degree of shock. I don't know how many of you remember this. A lot of Brits and US said, it's a rust bucket, it doesn't really matter, until our Australian partners pointed out, no, this is a self-sustaining flotilla and it's the first time they've done it in a long time, please watch out. And since then, my longer-term interest in the Navy and strategy has come to, well, this is about global deployment of power. This is why it's so important for us to have economic, naval, and then obviously Liz does naval too, but also the other aspects, the regional aspects. This is where we end up talking about not just the Arctic but Antarctica, the role of the Indo-Pacific in it. So it's a global horizon. So we can talk all day long about the strategy. This is assumptions, plans and implementations, but it's that global horizon that we really want to push out with this. And the projection of power means a number of different things that we will want to think about. But mental maps and this global horizon is really the thrust of the book. And once again, thank you for hosting us.
Okay. Well, thank you, and please join me in thanking the panelists for this interesting conversation today.